Dave the Diver is one of those games that should not work. Every time I try to explain it to somebody, I sound completely insane. You're a diver, then you're running a sushi restaurant, then you're upgrading weapons, then you're exploring underwater ruins, and then you're back at the restaurant. And somehow, all of it still feels like one game. Cult of the Lamb is the exact same way. Half the game is fighting monsters, the other half is basically being a middle manager for a cult. And somehow that works too. The weird thing is, these aren't the only games that do this. The more I started paying attention, the more I noticed the same pattern showing up everywhere. And eventually, I realized these games are trying to solve a problem that almost every game runs into. The first time I played Dave the Diver, I didn't really think much of it. I figured it was a diving game. You go underwater, catch fish, upgrade your gear, and repeat. But then the game sends you back to the sushi restaurant, and suddenly you're not a diver anymore. You're managing staff, serving customers, upgrading recipes, making money. Then it sends you back underwater. And then back to the restaurant, and then back underwater again. The more I played, the more I realized Dave the Diver keeps changing my job. And Cult of the Lamb does the same exact thing. One minute you're fighting monsters in the dungeon. The next you're assigning jobs, collecting resources, and solving problems for your followers. What's interesting is that plenty of games have side activities. Stardew Valley lets you fish, mine, farm, and talk to villagers whenever you want. But Dave the Diver and Cult of the Lamb do something different. They don't just give you options, they make you switch. Once I noticed that, I started seeing this pattern everywhere. But that still doesn't explain why this feels so good. Why does constantly switching jobs make these games so hard to put down? I think it comes down to a problem that every game eventually runs into. Familiarity. Think about the first fish that you catch in Dave the Diver. It's exciting. You don't know what's down there, you don't know what you're gonna find. Every dive feels like an adventure. But eventually, you've caught that fish before. You've seen that area before. You know what to expect. The same thing happens in Cult of the Lamb. The first dungeon run feels dangerous. A few hours later, you're mostly just going through the motions. And that's not because the gameplay got worse or the mechanics got worse. It's because your brain got used to it. The problem isn't bad gameplay. The problem is familiarity. Eventually, everything becomes normal. And that's a surprisingly difficult problem to solve. Because once a game finds something fun, their natural instinct is to keep giving players more of it. More combat, more enemies, more weapons, more levels. And sometimes that works. Doom is probably one of the best examples. Doom doesn't need a farming system, or a restaurant, or a cult to manage. The entire game is built around one thing: rip and tear. But that means the combat has to carry everything. Every weapon, every enemy, every arena, every upgrade. The game is constantly finding new ways to keep that one activity interesting. And that's really hard to do. So, how do these games solve that problem? They don't do it by constantly introducing new mechanics. They do it by moving your attention somewhere else. Right when I'm starting to get tired of diving, Dave the Diver sends me back to the restaurant. Right when I'm getting tired of managing the restaurant, it sends me back underwater. Cult of the Lamb does the same thing. You spend time fighting through dungeons, then you're back at camp managing followers. Then you're back in the dungeon. And the genius of these games isn't that they have multiple gameplay loops. The genius is knowing exactly when to pull you out of one. Because by the time you come back, it feels fresh again. The diving didn't change, the combat didn't change, you changed. You had enough time away from it that it feels exciting again. And once I started looking at games through this lens, I stopped seeing two gameplay loops and I started seeing good attention management. But there's a trap here. Because once you realize players enjoy switching between activities, it's tempting to think that the solution is just adding more activities. A farming system, a fishing system, a crafting system, a restaurant, a town, a dungeon, a card game, and suddenly your game has 10 different things to do. But that's not what makes Dave the Diver work, and that's not what makes Cult of the Lamb work either. Because the goal isn't to give players more jobs, the goal is to give them the right job at the right time. Okay, here's why I've been obsessing with this. This idea got stuck in my head because I'm building my own game. It's called Tractors and Beams. And for a long time, I couldn't explain why the game had two completely different halves. During the day, you're farming, planting crops, expanding your farm, building up your little corner of the world. But at night, you're exploring alien ships, fighting enemies, collecting resources. On paper, those sound like two completely different games. And honestly, they kind of are. But the more I studied games like Dave the Diver and Cult of the Lamb, the more I realized that's exactly the point. I didn't add farming because I wanted a farming game, I added farming because I wanted players to leave. I wanted players to spend time away from the combat so that they would actually be excited to come back to it. And I wanted players to spend enough time away from farming that they would be excited to come back to that too. The goal isn't to keep players doing one thing forever, the goal is to make them want to return to it. And once I started noticing this pattern, I couldn't stop seeing it. Moonlighter does it. Fight enemies, tend to your shop. Slime Rancher does it. Go out and explore, ranch your slimes. Even Stardew Valley flirts with the same idea. Not by forcing you to switch jobs, but by constantly tempting you to. Farm for a while, then go mining, then go fishing, then go talk to villagers. They're all solving the same problem, just in different ways. And I think that's what makes this idea so interesting. Because when people talk about keeping games interesting, the conversation usually goes straight to content. More enemies, more weapons, more upgrades, more areas to explore, more stuff. And don't get me wrong, content matters. But the more I looked at games like Dave the Diver and Cult of the Lamb, the more I started to wonder if that's actually the problem they're solving. Because these games aren't constantly throwing new mechanics at you, and a lot of the time you're doing the same things over and over. The key difference is that they know when it's time to ask you to do something different. Maybe players don't need endless content. Maybe they just need a reason to change gears, a reason to leave, and a reason to come back. Because by the time you return, the thing that you left behind feels exciting again. Not because it changed, but because you did. When I started making this video, I thought that the best games were secretly two games. The same game with two different game loops. But I don't think that's actually true anymore. The real secret isn't having two gameplay loops. It's knowing exactly when the player is ready for a different one. And the more I pay attention to the games I love, the more I realize that's what they're really doing. They're not just giving me things to do, they're managing my attention. And somehow, the best ones make it feel effortless.